Welcome. I'm Noreen Hirschfeld, the Reuter Professor of Science and Religion, and it is my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Kenneth Miller. Ken is Professor of Biology and Royce Family Professor for Teaching Excellence at Brown University, where his research focuses on the structure and function of cell membranes. Ken has written several books, including 6 very widely used textbooks. He was describing them tonight as well. There's the elephant book and the lion book and the dragonfly book and the macaw book. So you can always tell a book by its cover. More germane to tonight's talk, he's also the author of Finding Darwin's God and Only a Theory on the relationship between evolution and religion. Ken received his PhD in biology from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he taught at Harvard for many years before moving to Brown. He's a strong advocate for evolution and for teaching science in the public schools, and he's testified at numerous trials, most notably the Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District trial, which challenged the school board's mandate to incorporate intelligent design into the science curriculum. The judge in that case ruled decisively in favor of the plaintiffs. Ken has received numerous awards, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science Award for Public Understanding of Science and Technology, and the Laetare Medal from Notre Dame, and he's a sought-after speaker. He's appeared on C-SPAN, The Today Show, and The Colbert Report, where he says he was tortured by a fellow Catholic. His visit tonight is co-sponsored by the Reuter Professorship, the Moral Theology Speakers Program, the Coach Chair in Catholic Thought and Culture, and the Biology Department. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Kenneth Miller.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Noreen for that generous introduction. I want to thank both colleges for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. When you go out on a speaking tour, you never know how you're going to be introduced. So I always like to bring my own introductory slide so I can tell you who I really am. I'm a cell biologist. As you heard, I work with the electron microscope on the structure of biological membranes. I publish in journals like Cell and the Journal of Cell Biology and so forth. Now, I see mostly young people in the audience tonight. I have to tell you, that always makes me very nervous. And the reason I'm nervous is because probably about half of you already know me and you don't like me. And the reason for that is if you used any of these books when you were in high school, I wrote them. So I'm the Miller and Miller Levine. I'm the one you can blame for that great big book you had to carry around in your backpack and stuff like that. Now, I should tell you something about what it's like to write a high school textbook. I live in a very small rural town in Massachusetts called Rehoboth, Massachusetts. It's very small, only about 8,000 people. It's one of the oldest towns in the United States. It was founded in 1643. And for quite a few years, a lot of people in the town knew me, but it wasn't because of what I did for a living. It's because for like 10 years, I was kind of like the commissioner of the girls' softball program. So I ran the spaghetti suppers to earn money. I trained our umpires. I used to coach one of our all-star teams in the summer. So everybody kind of knew me as the softball guy. But then one day, the high school in our town adopted our textbook. You can barely see it here. It's one with elephant on the cover. And my name was in there, my picture was inside, and all of a sudden my cover was sort of blown. And you might think it's like really cool to have the high school in your town use a book that you wrote, and I guess it is. But a lot of funny things happened that year. And about a month into the school year, I'm driving up to the high school to pick my youngest daughter, Tracy, up after field hockey practice. I pull in front of the high school, and there's a woman there I know through softball, another coach. Her name is Bonnie Kelly. And Bonnie sees my little red pickup truck. She gets very excited. She flags me down. And I pull up in front of her, I roll down the window, and Bonnie goes, Ken, you wrote the book they use in the high school now. And I was very proud. So I smiled, and I puffed out my chest, and I said, yes, Bonnie, I did. And then she looked me straight in the eyes, and she said, funny thing is, you don't seem that smart. So I was never quite sure what to make of that. It might have been a compliment, might not have been, whatever. But as you also heard, I've written 2 books for general audiences on the issue of evolution. Finding Darwin's God is more or less about the issue of evolution and faith. And Only a Theory is more a political book about the political battles we've had over evolution in the United States. And I think it's fair to say that even today, in 2015, evolution remains a flashpoint for American education and culture. It's a battleground. It's something we argue about a lot. Not a year goes by without various state legislatures introducing and sometimes passing bills to curtail the teaching of evolution in the public schools, or to introduce what are called alternatives to evolution. Here, for example, is something that I found absolutely remarkable. When the most recent Cosmos series aired, it turns out that one Oklahoma station, and Cosmos aired on Fox, one station simply edited out every reference to evolution in the Cosmos series, presumably because they thought their viewers would appreciate that. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this is really what I want to talk about tonight, is that all this fits into what I would call the God versus science stereotype. And last year, there were 2 highly publicized national events that really reinforced the God versus science stereotype. One of them was a debate that happened just about a year ago between Bill Nye, the science guy, and Ken Ham. He's the leader, Ken Ham is the leader of the largest anti-evolution organization in the country. It's an outfit called Answers in Genesis. And they've built this beautiful $30 million theme park called the Creation Museum in northern Kentucky to argue that the earth is 6,000 years old, evolution is a lie, all organisms appeared simultaneously during a 6-day creation week. And one of these events, again, this is the Bill Nye versus Ken Ham debate. This reinforced the idea, although I think Mr. Nye did a splendid job, it often seemed that he was arguing against the Bible or was arguing against God. And a lot of people took this as a science versus religion debate. Another event was actually in that Cosmos series. And if any of you saw it, and I hope you did because it was terrific science, but the opening narrative talked about a medieval person named Giordano Bruno. They had a little cartoon about Bruno's life. He was a 16th century Dominican. He was a philosopher and an astrologer. And as it turns out, he was condemned by church authorities. And in the Cosmos recreation of this, look how the church authorities appear. They're almost like devils. Their eyes glow in the darkness. And indeed, as the series faithfully recounts, Giordano Bruno was in fact burned at the stake. The Cosmos series depicted him really as a martyr to science, even though the principal charges against him were theological heresy. They didn't have to do with astronomy as Cosmos implied. And again, Cosmos set this up in a way that made it appear that faith was superstitious and therefore the enemy of science. And narratives like this sort of feed into the stereotype that you can see in this cartoon, where you have a bunch of eyes in the darkness, you have a candle called science, and the people up here are saying, hit it with your Bible. Now, that God versus science stereotype is actually pretty common in our culture. And there are examples everywhere. Here's one of my favorite ones. This is a photograph of a front of a church. A friend of mine snapped this in Florida and emailed it to me. And it says, if man evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? And indeed, these examples reinforce the science versus faith stereotype. They actually go back to the late 19th century in the United States, when this book by Andrew White was published called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. So that warfare mentality goes back actually to the century before the last. Now, the other thing I have to tell you is I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to public audiences on the topic of evolution, and I have had people ask me exactly that question, which is, if we evolved from apes, why are there still apes? And I want to tell you in advance how I answer that question, which is when someone asks it, I say, okay, sir, I'll answer that question in a minute, but first I have a question for you. Where did Protestants come from? And usually I get a dumbfounded look, and I said, no, come on, 93 Theses, the church door, Martin Luther, the Reformation, it was in all of them. They go, oh, I guess Protestants came from Catholics. Are Catholics still here? That's the answer to the question. And the reason, for example, that monkeys and apes are still here is not because we evolved from them, we didn't, but rather because we, like all Christians today, shared a common ancestry in the same way in which the branches of Christianity share a common theological ancestry. And that's the answer to that question. Now, it turns out that these battles still go on. For me, the latest battleground was Texas. Texas is a state, and if you're from the South, you may know this. Texas is one of many states in which the State Department of Education buys all the textbooks for all the school districts in the state. Therefore, in those states, the textbooks have to pass through a very political review process. And it turns out, you can see the headline here, Evolution Debate Again Engulfs Texas Board. This was in 2013. Texas Education Board flags one biology textbook over evolution concerns, and guess which one it was? This is our book, Miller and Levine. This is the Texas version of our book, and this was the one that they thought was so objectionable. And in fact, the opponents of evolution, because our book had a very strong treatment of it, argued that our book had a series of errors in it that needed to be corrected. The basic error we made is that saying that evolution actually took place, and that it explains the origin of species. And in fact, when our book was actually sent out for expert scientific review, the experts said there aren't any mistakes in that book. This is accurate, and in fact, our book now is the leading textbook in the state of Texas. And I'm very proud of that because we did it against considerable opposition. But you still hear this, and you hear this a lot. We're about to enter a political season, of course. We're already revving up for the presidential elections next year. And one of the people who's been most outspoken on this issue is actually a conservative politician and talk show host whom I rather like, and this is Mike Huckabee. Mike Huckabee is one of many people who has rejected evolution, and he's rejected it for what I would call a culture war reason. And in fact, a couple of years ago, when he was also running for president, he said the following: if anybody wants to believe that they are the descendants of a primate, they are certainly welcome to do so, but of course Governor Huckabee did not. Now, the first time I heard that, living in Massachusetts, right next to New Hampshire, I began to fantasize about going up to New Hampshire during presidential primary season. And one of the cool things about the New Hampshire primaries, true in Iowa as well, is you can actually get to meet these guys. You walk up to them at the street, find them in a coffee shop, and I thought maybe if I go up to Manchester, New Hampshire, or to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, maybe I'll get a chance to meet Governor Huckabee. And if I do, and I'll still do this year, I'll say, Governor, I really like your attitude. You're a very outgoing guy. I don't agree with all your political positions, but you're very clear. Nobody ever doubts where you stand. But you remember that thing you said about evolution, Governor? I'm a trained biologist, and I have to tell you something. Governor, you are a primate. And not only that, so were your mom and dad. So you are descended from a primate, whether you believe it or not. Now, I'm not sure how well he would take that, but I certainly want to avoid him the embarrassment of not appreciating the fact that human beings are primates. But of course, he's not alone. And the governor in your neighboring state, Scott Walker, basically says that I don't want to say anything about evolution because I'm not a scientist, thereby trying to appeal to what you might call the anti-evolution vote that comes up in the election. Now, the interesting thing about evolution, and I always find this astonishing, is it seems to be a complicated idea, but it is actually a very simple one. And there are 4 basic statements, and they arise from the work that Darwin did, about how evolution works. And the first one is a factual observation. Variation exists in natural populations. And all you have to do to see that is look around the auditorium. Look at the variation that we all have in height, hair color, skin color, eye color, blood type. That's true of all organisms, and that's a fact. Number 2, many more offspring are born each season than can possibly survive to maturity. Now, this is not always apparent in our own species because we try to make sure that every one of our offspring survives. But think of an oak tree or think of a dandelion and think of what the world would be like if every single acorn survived, sprouted, grew into another oak tree, each of which then every growing season produced another 5,000 acorns. Pretty soon the world would be nothing but dandelions, nothing but oak trees, and so forth. As a result of this, there is in fact a struggle for existence. The struggle for existence can take many forms. It can be predator-prey interactions. It can be the kind of struggle that exists between blades of grass, each struggling for sustenance, for moisture, for sunlight, and so forth. As number 4, Characteristics that are beneficial in the struggle for existence will tend to become more common in the population, and this will change the characteristics of a species. Every one of these first four statements is verifiable fact. You can see it operating in the natural world, and you can show that it is real. From these four statements comes a conclusion, and that is that over time, and given a steady input of new variation, these processes lead to the emergence of new species. Darwin didn't know where that new variation came from. Today, we do know. And that conclusion, on the basis of those four statements, is on more solid ground than ever before. Now, how do we know that evolution happens? How do we know that it accounted for the origin of species? Well, there are lots of lines of evidence. One of the best lines of evidence comes from fossils. And I could go into fossils in great detail. I'm only going to give you examples of two really spectacular and well-understood fossil transitions. But the National Academy of Sciences a few years ago summed it up by saying, look, so many intermediate forms have been discovered, so many different types of fossils, that it is often difficult to identify categorically where the transition occurs from one to another particular species. And that's exactly what we would expect in an evolutionary transition. About 10 years ago, a colleague of mine at Brown named Steve Gatesy was working with a group of paleontologists on the island of Ellesmere in the Canadian Arctic. And they were up there because rocks are exposed there of a very critical period in the Earth's history called the Devonian. And they were looking for the very earliest amphibians. And Steve was set down by a rocky hillside, have his lunch, and he turned around and he saw a little piece of rock sticking out at him. And he went up and he sort of brushed the debris around behind it, and it became apparent to him that wasn't a rock at all. It was the fossil snout of this organism. And he called the other people over, and over a couple of months before the Arctic summer ended, they were able to dig the fossil out. They went back there in subsequent years, and they found more than 20 specimens of this organism, to which they gave the name Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is an incredible intermediate between lobe-finned fish and the very earliest amphibians. And Tiktaalik turned out to complete a series, which you now see in biology textbooks everywhere, explaining how the earliest tetrapods, four-legged vertebrate animals, came to be. Tiktaalik fits right in here in the middle of this transition. Earlier on in lobe-finned fish, there is a front limb that, believe it or not, has 8 digits. These presage the phalanges in the fingers, the wrist bones, the bones of the lower arm, and we understand exactly how they evolved step by step into the front limbs of the earliest amphibians. It's an extraordinary fossil series, and it's one of two very, very good examples of a transition, in this case, from water to land, and there's another example of a transition from land to water. This is the transition of swimming mammals like whales and dolphins back into the water from their land-dwelling ancestors. Both of these transitions have been written up brilliantly in a book by Carl Zimmer. That's Z-I-M-M-E-R. For my money, Carl Zimmer is the best science writer in America today. He wrote this great book called At the Water's Edge, Fish with Fingers, that refers to these guys, and Whales with Legs, that describes the intermediate forms that document the evolution of whales. Now, of greater interest to most of us, I would think, is the human fossil record. And people often wonder, have we found the missing link yet? Well, it turns out not only have we found it, but we have so many missing links that it's hard to tell how to draw the lines between them. These are some examples of the pre-human species that existed on this planet at various timescales prior to our own emergence as a species. The hard part is that we have an embarrassment of riches. We're not really sure which ones are our direct ancestors, which ones are our second cousins, which branches are an offshoot, and which lead directly to us. But what is clear is that we appeared on this planet as the result of an evolutionary tree, the same way that every other organism did, and that is by evolving and by splitting into species after species. Now, I would go on and tell you about the details of all of these fossils, but I'm not a paleontologist. I'm a cell and molecular biologist. And to me, the most powerful evidence of evolution isn't written in rock and stone, it's written in the language of DNA. the most spectacular evidence for evolution is found clearly in the human genome. This is the cover of the journal Nature. This particular issue came out almost exactly 10 years ago today. It was the first sequence of the chimpanzee genome. We already had the human genome at the time this came out. And you can see from the write-up in this article, here's what the lead authors of this great paper wrote. More than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that we humans share recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction and have refined the relationships. And that's really, really true. And I want to show you a couple of the ways in which molecular studies have confirmed the idea of our common ancestry with other species. Here's one way that has always struck me as being particularly impressive. This is actually a photograph in utero of an early human embryo. You can see the embryo right here, but you'll notice the embryo seems to have this great big balloon in front of it. What is it? That balloon is called a yolk sac. This is a cross-section diagram from Gray's Anatomy, showing an even earlier stage in human embryological development. This is inside the uterus. The embryo is this little disc right where I'm pointing the laser. There is an amniotic sac on one side and the yolk sac below it. So what's in a yolk sac? And here's actually a better diagram showing the yolk sac and the embryo right here in 3 dimensions. Well, you might think that what's in a yolk sac is yolk, but it turns out that's not true. A yolk sac like this does form in birds and reptiles where it actually encloses the yellow yolk of an egg. But the egg of placental mammals like us doesn't have much yolk. So the yolk sac of a placental mammal, a human embryo's yolk sac, is absolutely empty. There is nothing inside it. We call it a yolk sac only by analogy because it forms in exactly the same way and exactly the same place as yolk sacs of other vertebrates that really do enclose yolk. So why do we do it? Why do our embryos form a yolk sac with no yolk inside? Well, in terms of thinking of our species as being sort of like intelligently designed from scratch, there's no explanation for this. It doesn't make any sense. But in evolutionary terms, it makes perfect sense. And that is because all mammals, ourselves included, evolved from animals, specifically reptiles, that laid yolk-bearing eggs. So that empty yolk sac is actually a mark of our evolutionary history. So that's an inference that biologists have been able to make for about 100 years. But in the last 15 or 20 years, it's gotten a whole lot better than that. So here's the insight. If the ancestors of mammals like us once had yolk, then surely the mammalian genome once had genes that would code for the yolk protein vitellogenin. Now, I think all of you who have studied dietary nutrition know that the yolk of an egg is very rich in protein. The specific protein that's in there is called vitellogenin. We don't make vitellogenin because we don't produce much yolk in our eggs. But you might wonder if the human genome is descended from organisms that once produced vitellogenin, could the remnants of those genes somewhere be still hidden inside the human genome in one of our chromosomes? Well, the answer turns out to be yes. This is a paper that appeared just a couple of years ago in 2008, and it turns out that each of us, you and me, carry around in our genome the remnants of every single one of the yolk protein genes that are found in reptiles and in birds. They're called vitellogenin 1, 2, and 3. They're broken. They don't work. They don't code for anything. They are useless, but they sit there in our genome as a remnant of our evolutionary ancestry. It becomes almost impossible to argue that we didn't have an evolutionary ancestry because there's the evidence right within our DNA. The late Stephen Jay Gould, who I think was the best writer, the best popularizer of evolutionary theory ever, once called things like this the senseless signs of history. And here's what he wrote in one of his essays. If organisms have a history, then ancestral stages should leave remnants behind. Remnants of the past that don't make sense in present terms. The useless, the odd, the peculiar, the incongruous, like the empty yolk sac, are the signs of history. They supply proof that the world was not made in its present form. And that empty yolk sac and those non-functional vitellogenin genes provide proof that we also have an evolutionary history. Now, I want to go a little further than this. We've known or suspected for a very long time that we share recent common ancestors with the other great apes, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, and so forth. There's a lot of evidence for this. But there's one peculiarity about this. We humans have 46 chromosomes. All the other great apes, without exception, every one of them have 48. Now, all the biology students in the room, I won't ask you to raise your hands, don't worry about it, all know that those 46 chromosomes come in two sets. Each of us got 23 from mom, and we got 23 from dad. A baby chimp gets 24 from its mom and 24 from its dad. So you and I are missing a pair of chromosomes. Now, if we shared common ancestry with all of these guys, that common ancestry also had 24 pairs. So how did it come to pass that we're missing a pair of chromosomes? Is it possible, for example, in the lineage that led to us, that a pair of chromosomes just got trashed, they got left out during reproduction or something like that? Well, the answer to that is no. The loss of both members of what biologists call a homologous pair of chromosomes would be fatal. You couldn't even get through embryonic development. So there's only one possibility, which is consistent with evolutionary common ancestry, and that is that two chromosomes that are still separate in the other primates got accidentally fused together. They got stuck together to form a single chromosome in us. That would drop us from 24 pairs down to 23. So that's the explanation. But, however, that's just an explanation. That's not evidence. But this is why evolution is not theory, not conjecture. This is why evolution is scientific. It makes a testable prediction. If we do share common ancestry with these organisms, then somewhere in the human genome, there must be a recently fused chromosome. That means in your DNA and mine, we must have evidence of a chromosome that recently was formed by the fusion of two other chromosomes. Now, how would we find that? It turns out it's way easier than you might think. I've sketched a couple of chromosomes up here. Here's one, here's another one. Every chromosome near its tip has a very special, easy to recognize DNA sequence called the telomere sequence, and I colored that in blue. Also near the center of every chromosome, there's an equally special region called the centromere. I colored that in red. If one of the chromosomes that you and I are carrying around tonight was formed by the fusion of two chromosomes, you know what it would look like? It would have telomere DNA sequences where they don't belong, in the middle of the chromosome, sort of like the Scotch tape that's holding the two halves together, and it should have something that no chromosome is supposed to have, two centromeres. So the question is, do we have such a chromosome? Well, I'm not going to keep you in suspense. The answer is yes. Human chromosome number 2 has every characteristic I have just described. And in case you haven't been following how much we know about our genome, read what it says in the paper. The precise fusion site has been located between bases, you ready for this? 114,455,823 and 114,455,838. That is a 25 base pair region. That's where the Scotch tape is, that is holding the two halves of our chromosome number 2 together. It's in your DNA and it's in my DNA. DNA sequences are not hypotheses, they're not conjectures, they're not theories. DNA sequences are facts. And it's a fact that we can see the record of our own common ancestry with these other organisms right in our DNA, not just here in chromosome number 2, but in scores of other places as well. Now, there's a number of popular books that have been written about this, talking about the way in which molecular studies provide conclusive proof of our common ancestry. I included some of this in my book, Only a Theory, a couple years ago, but there are some others. Relics of Eden is a very good one that deal exclusively with this. So the question, I think, for tonight is not whether we evolved, but rather what are we to make of the fact that we evolved. And from that point of view, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to point to an article that came out the end of last year in the New York Times. It was an op-ed piece. It was written by David Viraj at the University of Washington. David's a very well-known biologist, and like me, he teaches a great big lecture-style first-year introductory biology class at his university. And you can see the title of his op-ed piece, God, Darwin, and My Biology Class. And part of what he wrote was, every year around this time, with the college year starting, I give my students the talk. The talk is not, as you might expect, about sex, but rather about evolution and religion and how they get along. Or, and this is Viraj speaking, more to the point, how they don't get along. And that was the point that Dr. Viraj wished to make in the New York Times article. And one of the things he wrote is right up here. Evolution has demolished previously potent pillars of religious faith and undermined belief in an omnipresent and omnibenevolent God. How has it done that? Well, he made 3 points, and I've numbered them. Evolution is an entirely natural and undirected process, I agree. Random variation plus natural selection. It has all that's needed to generate extraordinary levels of non-randomness. Living things are wonderfully complex, but altogether within the range of a statistically powerful, entirely mechanical phenomenon. He thinks that's a big deal. And specifically, he argues that it's a problem to point out that life was generated by purely natural processes. I don't think that Dr. Viraj, who knows a lot about biology, knows a lot about theology. Because if I was to meet him, and I hope to someday, I would recommend he read St. Augustine. Augustine wrote some marvelous things, but one of my favorite Augustine quotes is this one. The universe was brought into being in a less than fully formed state, but was gifted to transform itself from unformed matter into a truly marvelous array of structure and life forms. Augustine believed in what today we call a continuing creation, that creation was a process, and the universe was born in a dynamic state capable of self-transformation. That's exactly what Dr. Viraj defined and said was a theological problem. St. Augustine would simply shrug and say, even before Charles Darwin, writing in the beginning of the 5th century, we understood that that is indeed the case. Now, Viraj went on, and he said, there is no supernatural trait that's ever been found in Homo sapiens, our species. We are good animals, natural as can be, indistinguishable from the rest of the living world at the level of structure as well as physiological mechanism. I'm a cell biologist. You can't tell human cells in the electron microscope from the cells of any other mammal or most other animals. So he's absolutely right. At the level of biochemistry, physiology, and cells, we're just another living thing. But is it a problem to think that we are an ordinary part of the natural world? I remember another book, not written by Charles Darwin, that had this quote in it. Remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. And what that biblical admonition basically says is that we are made of the ordinary material of this earth. And that's exactly what Viraj thought was a problem for theology. I don't think the authors of this biblical passage thought that was a problem. I thought that was I think they believed it was a reflection on our intimacy with the natural world. That's what I think too. He says, the more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that living things, including human beings, are produced by a natural, amoral process, no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. Now, he is right that evolution does not require God as an explanation. I mark that as true. But the reality is, you can then ask a deeper question, a question in which I don't think he has any interest. Why should nature be structured in such a way that it can support the extravagant creativity of the evolutionary process? And science has no answer to that. Science has no answer to a lot of why questions. But faith can answer it in a very straightforward way and can see that creativity as the work of that very same creator. So my advice to Professor Viraj would be this, which is to skip the talk and to focus on biology itself, which I am sure he teaches brilliantly. Evolution, properly understood, does not support the case against God that he wishes to make with it. And that's what I want to expand upon now. People often argue about whether or not life is designed, whether there is a design to life. And I will come right out and say, yes, I do think living things have a design. The nature of that design is an evolutionary one. You saw that evolutionary design in the remnants of vitellogenin genes in our genome. You see the evolutionary design in the fusion point in chromosome number 2 and many other marks as well. This is an inherent part of the natural world. So here's the lesson. The capacity for evolutionary change is built into nature. And for people of faith, this makes it possible for them to understand evolution as part of what you might call God's providential plan. Now, I'm certainly not the only person who feels that way. This is Simon Conway Morris, one of the most famous paleontologists in the world. He teaches at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. Simon Conway Morris was responsible for one of the great breakthroughs in paleontology about 25 years ago. And this is the re-understanding, or the new understanding, of the fossils in a formation called the Burgess Shale in British Columbia, which represent Cambrian animals. And Conway Morris completely revolutionized our understanding of these very, very ancient animal forms. Conway Morris is also a Christian, and he wrote a book called Life's Solution: Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. And in this, he argued that the evolutionary process, far from being random, the evolutionary process tended to converge on certain solutions. And one of those solutions was self-reflective intelligence and awareness as personified in our own species. This is what he saw the process of evolution leading to, and this was central to his belief that faith and science are in fact consistent with each other. So, to answer the question that was implied in the title of my talk tonight about is there room for God in the evolutionary process, what I would say is, as a biologist, we don't have to find room for God in the evolutionary process, because if God exists, then the process itself is part of a natural world of his own making. And I think that's a key point. Very often when people discover that I'm a Christian, they'll say, well, where does God fit into the evolutionary process? Because they're looking for a big thumb to show up on the scale, or a finger to poke through the dike, or some sort of miraculous intervention to be documented by science. I don't think that's necessary, because the natural world itself is sufficient to accomplish that aim. Nonetheless, I do agree that, in fact, scientific concepts like evolution, the Big Bang, other things, are very troubling issues for people of faith, and that's especially true for Christians. And I want to show you a little teaser from a Nova series about 15 years ago on evolution that I had a hand in helping to edit. And this is from the last program. And the title of the last program in this 8-hour series was What About God? And you'll see from this teaser what this last program was actually about.
The majesty of our earth, the beauty of life. Are they the result of a natural process called evolution, or the work of a divine creator? This question is at the heart of a struggle that has threatened to tear our nation apart.
That's an outdated religious book. Science has shown you can't
For
trust that
fundamentalist
book.
Christians
You can't
like
trust
Ken
biology.
Ham,
Biology is
evolution
biology.
is an
So you
evil
can't trust
that
it.
must be
Morality,
fought.
You can't hold up your moral hand.
Well, I think it's a war. It's a real battle between worldviews.
For embattled teachers in Lafayette, Indiana, evolution is a truth that must be defended.
I think they think someone will come out a victor, and I don't believe that that's going to be the case.
If you look at the Bible, if you look
For
at
Christian
Scripture,
students at Wheaton
arguments-
College,
multiple
evolution
arguments
is an
on
idea that is
redemption,
hard to
how
accept.
Christ as one man.
Where is God's place if everything does have a natural cause?
For all of us, the future of religion, science, and science education are at stake in the creation-evolution debate. Today, even as science continues to provide evidence supporting the theory of evolution, for millions of Americans, the most important question remains: what about God?
And indeed, I think for many people that is the question. So how can people of faith reconcile themselves to ideas like the Big Bang? We'll take the Big Bang specifically. So I want to start off with what you might call a quiz. And that is, who is it who developed the mathematical foundations of cosmic expansion, which we call the Big Bang? Now, when I ask my own students this, usually the most common guess is Albert Einstein. But it wasn't Einstein. It was the person you see standing next to Einstein in this picture. And as you can see, he was wearing a Roman collar. It turned out he was a Belgian priest trained in mathematics and physics, who, when Einstein published his work on general relativity, immediately understood and explained to Einstein that this implied an expanding universe. This was Father Georges Lemaitre. Lemaitre is well known now as the father of the Big Bang. Einstein, as it turns out, for sort of anti-theological reasons of his own, preferred to believe in a steady-state universe, a universe that always was and always would be, because this would kind of get away from the need for a creator. And he was very suspicious when Lemaitre argued that you can trace the origins of the universe back to a point, because he thought Lemaitre, being a priest, was trying to pinpoint the moment of creation. Even Pope Pius XII thought that about Lemaitre, although Lemaitre constantly had to correct him. Now, there have been many books that have been written about Lemaitre. This is one of them, called The Atom of the Universe. But he was an absolutely extraordinary guy. And as you might expect, being the father of the Big Bang and being a priest, he was constantly asked, Father, how can you advance this theory of cosmic expansion? Because isn't it at odds with the Bible? Doesn't it contradict what Genesis says about creation? Well, there's a marvelous book written a couple years ago called The Day Without Yesterday, which is a recent biography of Lemaitre that comes straight up on this question. And John Farrell, the author of this, put a couple of quotes from Lemaitre to show how he answered that question. And here's one of them. He said, the writers of the Bible were illuminated more or less on the question of salvation. On other questions, they were just as wise or as ignorant as others of their generation. So it's unimportant if errors of historic and scientific fact are in the Bible, especially if those errors relate to the events that were not observed by those who wrote about them. In Genesis, the creation of the universe was certainly not observed by any human writer. And then he goes on, talking about the authors of Scripture. Because they were right in their doctrine of salvation and immortality, they got to be right on everything else, is simply a fallacy of people who have an incomplete understanding of why the Bible was given to us at all. So here's Lemaitre, the scientist and the priest, explaining that you have to have a complete understanding of Scripture to understand that it is not a scientific document. Charles Darwin, in fact, was often asked, doesn't evolution imply atheism? And in fact, he wrote a letter, a very famous letter, to a guy named John Fordyce. And Fordyce had previously written Darwin, asking him to basically confirm that one could not possibly be an evolutionist and a Christian. And Darwin was unfailingly polite in his correspondence. But when he wanted to make a point, he didn't mince words. And in fact, what he wrote here is he wrote back to Fordyce and he said, "Dear sir, it seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist." That's pretty harsh language, because Fordyce had suggested this to him, and Darwin says, no, it's not. It's absurd. And then, interestingly, he went on, and he said, Asa Gray, the eminent botanist, is another case in point. Now, you may not know the name, but you probably should, especially if you've studied botany. Asa Gray was on this U.S. stamp a few years ago. Asa Gray was the founder, basically, of the science of botany in the United States. He was a professor, the first professor of botany at Harvard. He founded the Arnold Arboretum and the Herbarium at Harvard. He also was Charles Darwin's first great advocate in the United States. He read The Origin of Species when it came out in 1859 and traveled the country lecturing about evolution. He also was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. And Darwin was fully aware that Asa Gray was not only his great champion in the United States, but also was a deeply religious man. And Darwin, not religious himself, was happy to point this out to correspondents like Fordyce. So Darwin certainly thought you could be an evolutionist and a Christian. Nonetheless, there's still an assertion. And the assertion is that evolution proves that God doesn't exist. I don't know how many of you paid attention to this, but a couple of years ago, there was a little billboard campaign that was bankrolled in part by Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist from Oxford. And they put little things on the side of a bus saying, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." Richard is actually a friend of mine. We correspond from time to time. And when I saw those things, I thought, I wanted to tell him, Richard, every psychological study I have ever seen has shown that deeply religious people worry less, not more, than those who are not religious. So this slogan makes no sense. But nonetheless, Richard, who I admire greatly as a writer about evolution, has been on an anti-religious kick for quite a while. The BBC, Darwin's 200th birthday, had a very, very nice interview in one of their science magazines with Richard Dawkins. And one of the things that they did was to ask him, is the theory of evolution compatible with divine creation? And Dawkins, of course, thought it wasn't. But they decided to have two Americans, guys from this side of the pond, to write further on that question. One of them was Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher of science at Tufts University in the Boston area, and he said no. Evolution is not compatible with divine creation, and the other person who they asked to write about this was me. And I was very happy to take a position opposite Dawkins and certainly opposite Dennett. And if any of you are interested in this, I know you can find it on the internet. But Dawkins is a very distinguished evolutionary biologist, is famous for making the argument against God, which he did in his best-selling book, The God Delusion, by invoking evolutionary biology and cosmology. And one of the things that he has said, not in this book, but in several of his other books, in 2 of them in fact, is the following statement. The universe we know about from evolution has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And every time I read that, I wonder, how does Richard manage to get up in the morning if that's what he thinks is going on? And I shared the platform with Richard a few years ago at a conference at NYU, and between breaks in the conference, I asked him that question. And you have to imagine this in the best snooty Oxford accent you can imagine, which is, well, the universe may not have a purpose, but I do. And that's the point that he liked to make. But I've puzzled over that quote, pardon me, for a very long time. What's the reason for this conclusion? Why would anybody say this? Well, the fact of the matter is, and Richard has pointed this out, is that the physical universe, the cosmos out there, is cold, indifferent, and in most places even hostile to life. That's certainly true on the moon. It's probably true on the surface of Mars. It's certainly true in interstellar space. Pretty rough place out there. But to me, the interesting thing is, how does Richard know that the universe lacks a purpose? Is purpose a testable scientific concept? And I want you to imagine the following. Every year, my discipline is cell biology, so I go to the cell biology meetings every year. And I want you to imagine that at the cell biology meetings in December of this year, I get up to give a little 15-minute talk, which is common at these meetings, and I say, through the research in my laboratory, I have discovered the purpose of life. And then I went on. I guarantee you people would be running out of the room laughing. They'd be calling people in from the hallway saying, come here, Miller's losing it. This is idiotic. Everybody knows you don't discover the purpose of life by doing scientific work. But very curiously, Dawkins thinks that science can discover the purpose of life, which is that it does not have one. And I would argue that any statement about purpose might be right, might be wrong, but it's not a scientific statement. So I want to go back to what he said right here, and I want to think about how other people with a different philosophical view from Richard would take exactly the same data, exactly the same science, and exactly the same universe. Because here's the point that I think he misses when he thinks the universe is cold, hostile, and purposeless. The universe actually also has the chemical and physical potential that made life possible in the first place. Because Dawkins would immediately say that life emerged on the surface of this planet in tune with the laws of physics and chemistry. I think that too. So the sort of people I would be thinking of are John Haught, who is a theology professor at Georgetown, who's written extensively on evolution, Francis Collins, who's an evangelical Christian and a very distinguished scientist. He's the director of the National Institutes of Health. Theodosius Dobzhansky, you'll meet him in a minute. Francisco Ayala, who's a very famous geneticist and also a Christian. How would they look at the same facts that Dawkins did? And I would argue that they could make the following statement, and that is the universe we know from evolution has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, the wisdom of a provident and purposeful God, intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world, committed to a promise of freedom that makes love possible. That's not a scientific statement, but neither was Dawkins, and that's the point. That's an interpretation of the universe that is nonetheless entirely consistent with science. Now, ironically, the two extremes of creationism and scientific materialism both agree that God must act directly to create living things. And since in science we don't think that happens, people will then use that to rule God out. But ignored is a crucial observation, and is one, to my knowledge, first made by the Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, which is that God does not so much make the world as to allow the world of life to make itself. And that's exactly what we see through the evolutionary process. And again, I want to let you know that this is a view that not just I hold, but many other people hold as well. A couple years ago, I was on a panel on science and faith at the World Science Festival in New York. If you ever get to go to New York in the summer when they're having the World Science Festival, buy a ticket to one of the sessions. These are great. These are just wonderful times. So here I am. I'm up on the stage with a few other people at the World Science Festival. And here's a snapshot of the panel. You can see where I am on one side. But you might notice this guy over here who has one of those funny-looking Roman collars on. And you might wonder, who is he and what's he doing up there? Well, that funny-looking guy is Guy Consolmagno. He is a Jesuit brother. Despite that elegant Italian name, he's actually an American. He grew up in New York City. He has a PhD in astrophysics from MIT. He's always at pains to explain to people that he's not a Jesuit priest, but he's a Jesuit brother. And when people are not sure what that means, he said, well, what it means is, I can hear your confession, but I can't forgive you. And I thought this audience might be able to relate to that. He's written a number of terrific books, one of which is called God's Mechanics. And what he did for this book was for 2 years go around talking to techno-geeks, scientists, engineers, computer programmers about their visions of religion, their sense of God. And he found, in contradiction to what a lot of people believe, that the level of belief, the level of faith among scientific and technical people is surprisingly high. And he sort of tried to describe the way in which this is true. The other thing that Guy told me, and we've become friends now because we've been on the platform together several times, is he told me because he's an astronomer, he actually is the Vatican's curator of meteorites. He likes to say that because of where his office is at Castel Gandolfo, he is the only person in the Vatican who is above the Pope, because the meteorite connection is just above the Pope's apartment at the summer residence in Castel Gandolfo. So people always ask him, is there something you see through the telescope that lets you say, there is God? And what he wrote is, my belief in God is not because of what I see in science. I turn it around, and I say I believe in science because of my faith in God. And what his point is, not so much that we should expect science to validate faith, but rather we should use faith to validate science. And he puts it this way in some of his other writing, it's not the case that I'm going to use science to disprove a religious point. That doesn't work. They both interact on a meta level. Religion is what motivates me to do science. Religion is what gives me the courage to say, there are going to be answers because the universe is rational. And the reason the universe is rational is because it had a creator that was governed by reason. And he went on in another of his books and he said, anybody who's trying to use God to explain the things that science can't explain in this century is a fool. Because who knows what science is going to explain by the time we get to the 23rd century. This is what's called a God of the gaps. It's also the fastest route to atheism. Because if your belief in God is a God who can explain why something happens, and then science comes along with another explanation, you're pretty much obligated to say, oops, suddenly I don't believe in that God anymore. And this notion of religion permeating science is actually quite common among even the most eminent science. Here's Albert Einstein, of course. Albert Einstein wrote something. He was not a religious believer in any conventional sense. And he said that scientific results are independent from religious or moral considerations, but the individuals to whom we owe the great creative achievements of science were all imbued with the truly religious conviction that this universe of ours is something perfect and susceptible to the rational striving for knowledge. So I'm often asked, what kind of God could exist in a scientific world in which nature acts according to orderly, predictable rules that can be studied, described, and understood? I think the answer is simple, and that is a God who fashioned a world that is both rational and intelligible. And all of us in science believe in such a world, or we wouldn't do science in the first place. So to people of faith, God is not the antithesis of scientific reason. Rather, God is the reason why science works in the first place. And that's an attitude that comes directly out of the thought of great thinkers like Augustine and also Thomas Aquinas. Now, many scientists have felt this way. This is Theodosius Dobzhansky, whose name I put on a previous slide, probably the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century. I've never met a scientist who would give me an argument along those lines. He wrote a terrific article many years ago. Title says it all. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I will guarantee you that every professor of biology at this school feels exactly the same way. Evolution is the glue that ties everything together in biology. But in this article, I want to show you a couple of paragraphs that he wrote. He said, the diversity of life is reasonable and understandable if the Creator made the world not by caprice, I would say not by creation or intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. Then he wrote, it is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. Dobzhansky was a Christian. He wrote, evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4004 BC. It is a process that began some 10 billion years ago and still is underway today. And that's a scientist giving his point of view on faith. How about a person of faith giving his point of view on science? This is the previous Pope, now Pope Emeritus Benedict. He was cornered by a group of Italian journalists about 8 years ago, and they asked him, what do you think about evolution? Can you be a Catholic and be a Christian in evolution? And what he said was kind of complicated. He said the contrast or the conflict between evolution and creation is an absurdity. Same word as Darwin, I like that. Because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being. Now that's kind of like Pope speak. Popes speak in very complicated language. So if you weren't quite sure what that means, you should do what I do, which is to turn to that publication that for me always clears things up in a single sentence, and that is, of course, the New York Post, which then printed this story under the headline, Evolution and God Do Mix Pope. End of story. So that nails it. But what about the current Pope? What about Pope Francis? Well, Pope Francis, first of all, is a Jesuit. He was originally trained as a chemist. Jesuits have been outspoken in their support of science, and that includes evolution. So what does one think when the Pope just a couple months ago said, come on, evolution and the Big Bang are real? Now, to a lot of people in the media, this was shocking. This was stunning. I was actually called up by both Time and Newsweek and asked to give some quotations that they could print to this incredible reversal of opinion on the part of the leader of the Catholic Church that evolution was real and the Big Bang was real. And I had to shrug and tell the reporters who called me up that this was the least surprising news story of 2014, given the Pope's and the Church's historic support for science. And I brought up, of course, Lemaitre and others. And in fact, what I tried to point out was something that also showed up in this article in the United Kingdom. Pope Francis's comments on the Big Bang are not revolutionary. They are in keeping with the very tradition that produced Georges Lemaitre. And I would add, as a nod to my geneticist colleagues in the audience, the very same tradition that produced Father Gregor Mendel as well. How do I feel about these things? Well, right about the time there was this landmark trial 10 years ago called Kitzmiller versus Dover, a trial in which I testified as the lead witness. Charles Krauthammer, who's a very conservative opinion writer for the Washington Post, wrote about this conflict over intelligent design and evolution that was taking place in this trial in Pennsylvania. And what he wrote was really quite remarkable. He said, how ridiculous it is to make evolution the enemy of God. What could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, more economical, more creative, indeed more divine than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct and yet interactive, all ultimately derived from accumulated variations in a single double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas Board of Education. And I think that's a remarkable statement. When I'm asked, personally, what do I think about evolution, don't I think it's degrading or demeaning to think that my ancestors were other primates or that life crawled out of the muck or something like that? I always look for the right words to try to explain. No, I don't think that's demeaning at all. In fact, I think it's a grand and glorious vision. But I can't come up, for the life of me, with words as good as the words that were written more than 150 years ago by the guy who kept this page in his notebook. And I don't know how many of you have seen this notebook page before. A couple years ago, I got to see the real notebook with my own eyes and touch it with my own hands, with gloves on, of course. And it was a great thrill. And you can see on this little notebook page, it says, I think, and then there's a tree of a kind that had never been drawn before. A couple things are labeled, explanation under here. And the guy who wrote this page, it was in 1837, by the way, came back a couple weeks later and wrote a few more explanatory notes up here. And it's very rare in the history of science. You can point to a single page in a notebook, and you can see right there, at the instant this person made this diagram, we see one of the great scientific discoveries of all time. But it's right there, and it's on that notebook page. And what this very same person wrote at the end of a book, a famous book that you have all heard of, is that he didn't find evolution to be degrading or demoralizing or debilitating or anything else. What he wrote was, I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That's the last sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And ladies and gentlemen, I think those are words to live by. Thank you very much for tonight.
Thank you very much, Ken. And I'd say we have about 20 minutes for questions, which Ken has graciously said that he'll take from you guys. So we don't have microphones for you, so I'm going to ask you to please stand up and just speak very loudly.
Okay, Tom, you were talking a pretty good game before this. You want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is more regarding your theology more than the question.
Okay.
So basically, how would you explain God sending down His Son by suspending the laws of nature through a virgin birth?
Can you hear in the back? How would you explain God sending down His Son through a virgin birth, suspending the laws of nature? Okay.
Who share striking similarities to many predating mythological figures such as the ancient Egyptian Horus, who was born of a virgin, born during the winter solstice, only Son of God, baptized at 30, crucified, died, resurrected after 3 days. How would you explain that?
I didn't know about the crucifixion of the God you're talking about, but whatever. Well, I explained it a number of ways. In that very same conference where Richard Dawkins and I were speaking in sequence, Dawkins got into a question period where he asked me whether I believed in ludicrous miracles like the virgin birth. And I said, look, then before I could go on, he said, well, if I was back in Bethlehem, I would have gone around with a DNA kit and a cheek swab, and I would have figured out who gave Jesus his Y chromosome. And we would have settled this virgin birth nonsense once and forever. So I decided, okay, you can play smartass, I can play smartass as well. Virgin births are actually quite common in other vertebrate animals. They are very common in reptiles, and they're especially common in birds. And in fact, virgin births are known rarely in chickens, but quite commonly in turkeys. And interestingly, you might resent the comparison of that virgin birth to this, but virgin births are not impossible. Nonetheless, and this is the way I answered Richard, if I was to give you a biological explanation for how a mammal with XY sex determination like us could in fact produce a virgin birth, and it was a correct scientific explanation, do you know what you, Richard Dawkins, would be able to say back to me? You'd be able to say, aha, so it wasn't a miracle after all. It was perfectly explicable in terms of science. Now, as a scientist, as a Christian, I accept the virgin birth. As a scientist, I have to say I'm agnostic. I have no data. I don't have any chromosome swabs. I don't have any empirical way to test it. And I take the virgin birth the same way that I would take the resurrection. Well, again, another doctrine, a central one, for which I have no scientific evidence one way or another. And I would say there's two possibilities here. One possibility is that's the way it happened. That's how it got into the oral accounts of the life of Jesus, and that's the way the gospel authors, some decades later, actually wrote it up. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is it never happened, but rather the authors of the gospel accounts, eager to draw the attention of people centuries hence to the teachings of someone who was so remarkable that they wanted to make sure that people did sit up and take notice, embellished those accounts by writing in the story of the virgin birth and the resurrection and so forth. As a scientist, I can't distinguish between those two alternatives. As a Christian, to be perfectly honest, either one of them is satisfactory for me. Either one works. But I think the central linchpin of Christian faith is very simple, and that is the divinity of Jesus and his mission to redeem us. And I think neither one of those is threatened by the appropriation of myths and legends from other cultures as they found their way into the gospel story. Okay, don't know if that's an adequate explanation, but it's the way I understand it. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you think of the theory that faith is merely the result of the evolutionary benefit of individuals coming together as a community during times in which resources were scarce? Living in a community of like-minded people gave advantages to those that didn't. So it's just a genetic effect, essentially.
Yeah, no, I think maybe the best exposition of that point of view has been written out by Edwin O. Wilson, in his book On Human Nature, which was published about 30 years ago. And Ed, whom I knew when I taught at Harvard, Ed argues that the religious impulse, which he sees as universal among our species, the religious impulse is really an impulse to coalesce around myth and ritual and form cohesive social groups. And that in the evolution of human culture, those groups that were able to do that, coalesce around myth and ritual and so forth, were, as you described, much better at raising food, raising babies, making war, and doing all of the things that make societies successful and make them endure. So that's where the religious impulse comes from. I'm perfectly okay with that explanation of the religious impulse. But you should realize that we can also explain other aspects of human thought and culture in exactly the same way. For example, one of the impulses that is universal among us humans is the scientific impulse, the tendency to look for deeper explanations of various phenomena and to understand those in a way that we can make sense of rationally. If evolution produced the religious impulse, then evolution also produced the scientific impulse. Evolution also produced in us the ability to do mathematics, concrete mathematics and also abstract mathematics. The fact that evolution produced those impulses and capabilities doesn't invalidate mathematics, it doesn't invalidate science, and I don't think it invalidates faith either. And finally, if you look at evolution as the mechanism by which God produced the species we have come to be today, why would it be so surprising that evolution would not also have produced the religious impulse to make us receptive of the idea of God's existence? So that's the way in which I look at it. Other questions? Way in the back, nice and loud, please.
Yeah, I don't think you gave enough credit to Dr. Viraj's third point about the amoral nature of evolution. So how do you address compatibility issues between the pain and suffering and death necessary for natural selection with benevolent God?
I think that's a fair criticism, and I think you're right. And I'll make a mental note, and I'll go in and I'll try to respond to that in more detail. But I'll respond to what you're asking right now. Evolution is often said to entail pain and suffering, and that is often said to be, either immoral or amoral. Why would a benevolent and loving God use a technique that entailed so much death and so much suffering? Well, the way I'd answer that is there's nothing special about the evolutionary process that requires pain and suffering. Every living thing will eventually die. And that would be true whether living things were created instantaneously 6,000 years ago, or whether living things have a long evolutionary history that goes back billions of years. Death and pain and suffering are not the invention of evolutionary theory or the creation of Charles Darwin. They are a necessary condition of life. So I don't see evolution as especially cruel at all. Again, every living thing that is born is going to die. I remember once talking to a group of, I think, college students, and I was talking about the fact that all of us are here tonight, and the only reason that any one of us is alive today is because other living things died to give us life, gave us life in nourishment. In other words, the supper you had tonight, things had to die in order for them to be put on your plate for supper. And I remember a student raising her hand and saying, "Not me, I'm a vegetarian." And my answer to that was, I did my doctoral thesis on the thylakoid membrane of Spinacia oleracea. And what that means is the photosynthetic membrane in the spinach chloroplast. The chloroplast is an object of incredible beauty. I spent the first 20 years of my scientific career working on these complex membranes, uncovering their architecture, producing beautiful electron micrographs that were beautiful not because of what I did, but because of what was already there in nature. And the electron microscope just revealed it, and it was stunning. And I said, when I saw you eating your salad tonight, my best estimate would be that with every forkful of spinach on your plate, you killed 50,000 chloroplasts, and it makes me very sad. So I say that not to trivialize your question, but to answer it this way, and that is that in order for life to exist, there has to be death. And that's true for every single living thing, ourselves included. And it's not unique to evolution. If we had been uniquely created out of nothing 6,000 years ago, death and suffering would still be with us. So I don't see evolution as a process that is any more amoral than any other type, any other process. And remember that admonition, remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. You could tell that to every other living creature, and it would be true whether evolution was true or not. Yes?
So the idea of the soul is pretty debatable, but most people would agree that we have a consciousness. What would you say is the evolutionary purpose of a consciousness? Because, I mean, an Aristotelian would say that, oh, the ability to rationalize leads to our higher good. So, what would you say?
Why don't you ask a tough question? Huh? As you alluded to.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. Let me do my best to repeat this. I think the question in essence was, what is the evolutionary purpose of consciousness if you accept that consciousness is a real thing? And the fact of the matter is that there are an awful lot of people in neurobiology who say that consciousness itself is an illusion. Daniel Dennett, that same philosopher I took issue with in that back and forth on the BBC, Daniel Dennett wrote a book about a decade and a half ago called Consciousness Explained. And a review of the book in Science was entitled Consciousness Unexplained. Because what Dennett was doing was basically to say that consciousness is kind of an illusion. It's sort of like the operating system of our mind. It's the way in which the mind or the brain actually works that gives us the impression that we are individual personal actors looking out at everything we see out there, and it enables us to relate to the world. Therefore, consciousness is a kind of self-delusion. I don't think consciousness is a kind of self-delusion. I think it's something that emerges, maybe what you might call an emergent property, of a very, very highly developed nervous system. And the other thing is, I don't think consciousness is unique to human beings either. I think consciousness is found in many animals. I have an Australian shepherd dog at home, one of the smartest animals I've ever had, and it's very hard for me to believe that he is not conscious of certain things. There are experiments that show that dolphins can be conscious of seeing themselves in a mirror and not just reacting to the reflection of themselves, but actually realizing that there are marks on their own bodies when they see them in a mirror and then going to try to look at or to touch that mark. And I think that's a kind of consciousness. I think ultimately, the way I would put it this way, and that is I wouldn't answer the question of what is the purpose of consciousness by giving it an adaptive purpose. I think too often in evolutionary biology, we'll look at something. Why do we have 5 fingers instead of 6 or 4? Why? Well, there are other things I could go into about the human body. And always looking for an adaptive explanation for why natural selection favored them. I think there are many characteristics that simply result from the evolutionary exploration of what you might call adaptive space. And often one corner of adaptive space is a highly developed nervous system capable of reflexive self-awareness and consciousness. And that's the part of adaptive space in which we sit. So I wouldn't assign purpose to it. I think consciousness is real. I think consciousness is one of the things that enables us to form social groups so effectively. And to go back to the question that you asked about evolution producing the religious impulse, the same E.O. Wilson has a recent book called The Social Conquest of Earth. And one of the things he talks about is that we humans, until very recently, 100,000 years ago, maybe 50,000 years ago, we were a very rare species. There weren't many of us. There were a few scattered tribes in Africa and Asia and Southern Europe and so forth. And then something happened. And as a result of that something, we became the dominant land mammal on this planet. Our numbers exploded. And he points to our ability to form social groups, coherent groups, whether they're organized around religion, politics, economics, or whatever. And I think that consciousness, the kind of extreme consciousness and self-awareness that we have, is what makes that sort of social grouping possible. So I think I don't reach for an adaptive explanation for consciousness. I think it simply emerges out of the complex nervous system, but from that comes another property. And that other property is the ability to form these very complicated social groups, which have made us successful as a species to the point where we actually threaten the existence of other species on this planet. Other questions? Yeah.
In the United States, there's a large percentage of people in comparison to other first world countries that do not accept evolution. Why do you think that is? And do you think that that's a problem that needs fixing, or not a problem?
Okay, so to add a little and paraphrase your question, in most opinion polls, between 40 and 45% of Americans say they reject the theory of evolution. That's unique among developed countries. It's much higher than than any country in Western Europe, much higher than Japan. It's not as high as Turkey, by the way. Only about 20% of Turkish people accept the theory of evolution. Why is that, and does that represent a threat? And I think why that is has several answers. The United States is also the most religious of all the industrialized countries, and I think rejection of evolution goes hand in hand with a certain kind of religious faith, and it's the kind of faith that sees the Bible not just as spiritual truth, but sees it also as a historical and scientific document. And therefore, any alternative idea as to the history of the cosmos, the Big Bang, the age of the Earth, geology, for example, threatens that view, or the evolution of our species threatens that idea and is therefore rejected. I think another part of it is a long history of anti-intellectualism and anti-elitism in the United States. Only in the United States would you get an expression like, well, if you're so smart, how come you ain't rich? That's something that Americans say quite easily. And Americans rebel against elite. Think about a politician. One of the harshest things you can say to criticize another politician is to call him an elitist. And that's true even though a founding father, like Thomas Jefferson, said this nation should be ruled by an aristocracy of merit. Today, that notion of an aristocracy of merit sounds quaint. It sounds almost anti-democratic, and yet that's coming from Jefferson, one of the founders of our democracy. So I think it's religious rejection of evolution on its face. I think it's a cultural problem where the advocates of evolution and scientists in general are seen as out-of-touch elitists who have a different value system from the rest of us. And then finally, I think it's good old American disrespect for authority. When I was first involved, and I think that's one of our most charming characteristics as a people, is the fact that we really do disrespect authority. And I remember when I was involved a couple years ago in going to Kansas to campaign, and I did this 2 summers in a row, to campaign for pro-science candidates to the Kansas Board of Education. And this was written up in a couple magazines. One of my English colleagues, whom I saw at a conference, said, why are you bothering to do this? Why does this persist? If something like this happened in Great Britain, we would just dispatch someone from Oxford or Cambridge. They would go to the local school board. They would explain how many degrees they had, how many royal societies they belonged to, and why the local people were wrong. The local people would then apologize. They would apologize for taking up the time of the Oxford or Cambridge Dawn, and they would correct their ways. Why wouldn't that work in the United States? And my answer was, how much do you really know about this country? So I think all those things come into play. And some of my more secular colleagues in the scientific community say that the religious rejection of evolution is the most important one. There's no point in trying to get religious believers to accept science because religion is inherently anti-scientific. I think exactly the opposite, by the way, but that's exactly what they say. And therefore, the only solution to this is basically to pull more people into the camp of non-believers, into atheists or agnostics, and then acceptance for science will rise. Does this represent a threat to this country? You bet it does. The United States in the 20th century, and still in this century, is the greatest scientific nation in the world. And if you doubt that, all you have to do is to look at where bright young people from all over the world come to study science in graduate school. Where do they come to earn their PhDs? They're coming here. They're going to Stanford. They're going to MIT. They're going to Caltech. They're going to the University of Wisconsin. They're going to places in this country because we have built the greatest scientific establishment in the world. That establishment exists in a democracy only at the pleasure of the people. And what I worry about most deeply, and I see this increasing in our political discourse right now, is the notion, the belief in many people that science itself is a values system that has no particular claim on the truth, and that scientists are just another political pressure group. I think that would be tragic for this country. One of the things that drew me into science as a young man was the fact that science was obviously non-political. One of my graduate school professors said that biology was a great field to go into because Republicans and Democrats tend to die from the same diseases. So therefore, there will always be support for biomedical research. I used to believe that. In the last 10 or 15 years, I've gotten a little worried about that. So those are my explanations for why our rejection of evolution is so high. There's my answer to, do I think it threatens our scientific preeminence? I think so. And I want to add, one maybe sort of last thing to all of that. I think I know whose fault it is. How many people in this room knew about that chromosome 2 fusion story before I told it tonight? Go ahead and raise your hands. Be brave. Okay, thank you. Can you see how few hands are up? Do you want to know whose fault that is? That's my fault. And it's the fault of everybody else in the scientific community who have failed to get that across, who have failed to make that a part of common knowledge. So the third failing in here is, frankly, the elitism of the scientific community. Very often, we look down upon people who do what Neil deGrasse Tyson did, go on TV and popularize science. We say, they're hamming it up. They're TV stars. They're not real scientists. Nonsense. Somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson is the greatest friend we have in science because he's taking the case for science to the public, and we in the scientific community ought to do a whole lot more of that. Oh, okay.
Okay, if you would like to hear more about that last question, religion, science, and public policy, Gary Eichten from NPR will be interviewing Ken and myself tomorrow in the Arts Center Auditorium from 12 to 1 on that very topic, religion, science, and public policy. Thank you very much for coming tonight.